The whole thing started with a mistake. A stupid, careless mistake. I had just finished my shower and was standing in front of my dresser, half-dressed, trying to decide between a loose blouse or something more fitted for the day. The summer heat was relentless, and the fan in my room did little to combat the beads of sweat forming on my neck. I wasn't in any rush. Greg was already out at work, and Mason, my stepson, had just come home from his morning run. I could hear his music thumping faintly through the walls. I didn't think to lock my door. Why would I? I was standing there in my bra and a pair of shorts when the door suddenly creaked open. "Lorraine, have you?" Mason's voice cut off mid-sentence. I turned sharply, clutching the blouse to my chest, my heart leaping into my throat. He stood frozen in the doorway, his face turning a shade of red I'd never seen before. His shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging to his chest, and his hair was damp, sticking to his forehead. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Mason," I managed to choke out, breaking the silence. "Sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know." Before I could say anything, he bolted, shutting the door behind him with a hurried apology. I stood there for a moment, stunned, clutching the blouse like it could somehow shield me from the embarrassment that had just unfolded. But it wasn't just embarrassment that made my cheeks burn. It was something else, something I didn't want to admit to myself. I caught my reflection in the mirror, my hair still damp from the shower, the faint blush spreading down my neck. And then I thought about the way Mason had looked at me, just for a split second, his eyes lingering longer than they should have before he turned and ran. It wasn't just shock on his face. I told myself I was imagining things, that it didn't mean anything. But even as I tried to brush it off, my pulse refused to settle. That moment should have been the end of it. But deep down, I think I already knew it wasn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way Mason froze in the doorway, his wide eyes locked on me for a fraction of a second too long. The way he muttered his apology and fled like a kid caught doing something he shouldn't. That kind of awkwardness was normal, expected even. But there was something else beneath it, something I couldn't put my finger on. I tried to brush it off as nothing. Accidents happen, and it wasn't like I'd never been walked in on before. But this time, it stuck with me. The memory replayed in my mind later that day as I folded laundry, as I prepared dinner, even as I lay in bed with Greg snoring beside me. Mason had been living with us again for a few months now. He graduated from college and was in that strange limbo between school and the real world. He hadn't landed a full-time job yet, but Greg insisted it was only a matter of time. Mason was bright, resourceful, and charming in a way that came effortlessly to him. I'd always liked Mason. He was polite and easygoing, never the type to cause trouble. But ever since he moved back in, I'd started noticing things I hadn't before. How much taller he'd gotten, how his once boyish frame had filled out with muscle. His confident demeanor had shifted too, taking on a quieter, more self-assured edge that was hard to ignore. And now I couldn't unsee it. That brief flash of something in his eyes when he'd looked at me in my bra, something I refused to name. The days that followed were a minefield of awkwardness. Mason avoided me at first, keeping his distance and barely making eye contact. At dinner, he'd mumble short answers to my questions before retreating to his room. Greg, of course, didn't notice a thing. He never did. My husband was always too preoccupied with work to pay much attention to the subtleties of what went on in our house. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Mason walked in, his usual headphones draped around his neck, his hair still damp from a shower. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice casual but careful, like he was testing the waters. I glanced at him, startled by the sudden offer. "Sure, if you want to peel these carrots," I said, gesturing to the cutting board. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small kitchen in a way that felt almost too big. For a moment, it was just the sound of the knife on the cutting board and the faint hum of the refrigerator. "I'm sorry about the other day," Mason said abruptly, breaking the silence. I froze mid-chop, my breath catching in my throat. "It's fine," I said quickly, hoping to shut the conversation down. "I didn't mean to." "You know," he continued, his cheeks flushing, "I should have knocked." I forced a laugh, trying to keep my tone light. "It's no big deal. These things happen." He nodded, but the tension lingered, hanging in the air between us like an unspoken secret. As the weeks went on, the awkwardness began to fade, replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite define. Mason started spending more time around me, helping with chores, joining me in the living room to watch TV, even offering to pick up groceries when Greg was too busy. It wasn't just his presence that changed. It was the way he looked at me. His glances lingered longer than they should have. His compliments felt more pointed. "That color looks nice on you," he said one evening as I was setting the table for dinner. I paused, startled. It was such a simple comment, but the way he said it made my pulse quicken. "Thank you," I said, keeping my tone neutral. He didn't say anything else, just smiled and carried on like it was nothing. But my heart was racing, and I hated how much I liked it. One evening, Greg announced he'd be out late for a work meeting. He left after dinner, giving me and Mason the run of the house. I was in the living room folding laundry when Mason wandered in, holding a bowl of popcorn. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the couch. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. He plopped down next to me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. He flipped through the channels until he landed on a movie, some action flick I wasn't paying attention to. At first, I focused on the laundry, folding each piece meticulously to keep my hands busy. But as the movie went on, I became hyper-aware of Mason's proximity. The warmth of his body next to mine, the faint scent of his cologne. Halfway through the movie, my hand accidentally brushed against his as I reached for the remote. I pulled back quickly, muttering an apology. "It's fine," he said, his voice soft. When I glanced at him, his eyes were already on me, studying my face like he was searching for something. My breath hitched, and for a moment the room felt too small, the air too heavy. I should have said something, done something to break the tension. But instead, I just sat there, my heart pounding, waiting to see what he would do next. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. Slowly, subtly, but undeniably. Mason wasn't a boy anymore, and I wasn't just his stepmother. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew better. This was just the beginning. I remember the exact moment things tipped past the point of no return. It was a Saturday evening, and Greg had left for an overnight work trip. The house felt unusually quiet, without the background noise of his gruff voice or the television blaring one of his detective shows. Mason and I were alone, the kind of alone that felt heavier than it should. I'd spent most of the day cleaning, keeping myself busy to drown out the thoughts that had started creeping into my mind more often than I'd like to admit. Thoughts about Mason. About the way his presence lingered in a room even after he'd left. About the way his eyes seemed to hold mine a little too long, as if daring me to acknowledge what was happening between us. That evening, he knocked on my bedroom door. A polite tap, like he was asking permission. I wasn't dressed for company, just wearing an old tank top and a pair of loose shorts. But when I opened the door, Mason didn't seem to care. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too casual. I hesitated. I was about to organize the attic. It's a mess up there. "Let me help," he offered, already moving past me into the hallway. The attic was hot and cramped, the kind of place you avoided unless absolutely necessary. Mason followed me up the narrow staircase, a flashlight in his hand. "Careful," he said, placing a hand on my waist as I climbed the last step. The touch was brief but enough to send a shiver through me. I tried to focus on the task at hand, sorting through boxes of old Christmas decorations and forgotten keepsakes. But Mason was always close, too close. Every time I moved, he was there, steadying me, brushing against me, his presence a constant reminder of how thin the line between us had become. At one point, I was balancing precariously on a stool, trying to reach a box on the top shelf. Mason stood behind me, his hands hovering near my waist like he was ready to catch me if I fell. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said, his voice low. "I've got it," I replied, but my voice lacked conviction. He reached up, his chest brushing against my back as he grabbed the box for me. The heat of his body against mine made my breath hitch, and for a moment, I couldn't move. When I turned to face him, he was still standing too close, his eyes locked on mine. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice barely audible. He didn't step back. Instead, his gaze dropped to my lips, lingering there for a moment that felt like an eternity. "You're welcome," he said, his voice soft. Neither of us moved. The air between us was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. I knew I should have stepped away, broken the moment before it spiraled into something we couldn't take back. But I didn't. When his hand brushed against mine, I didn't pull away. When he leaned in, his breath warm against my cheek, I didn't stop him. And when his lips finally met mine, I kissed him back. The kiss was tentative at first, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. But when I didn't, he deepened it, his hands moving to my waist, pulling me closer. My back pressed against the shelves, the forgotten boxes around us fading into the background. Every rational thought screamed at me to stop, to push him away and pretend this never happened. But his lips, his hands, the way he held me like I was something he'd been aching for, it drowned out everything else. I don't know how long we stood there, tangled together in the attic. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, our foreheads resting against each other. "We can't," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. "Yes, we can," he replied, his voice steady, certain. His hands lingered on my hips, his thumbs brushing against my skin. I should have said something, anything to end it, but instead, I let him kiss me again. That night, after the attic, we sat on the couch in the living room. Neither of us mentioned what had happened, but the space between us felt different, charged. We started watching a movie, though I couldn't tell you what it was. My mind was elsewhere, still replaying the way his lips had felt against mine, the way his hands had held me like he never wanted to let go. Halfway through the movie, Mason shifted closer. His hand brushed against mine, lingering just long enough to send my pulse racing. I didn't pull away. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "Yeah." But I wasn't okay. I was drowning in a sea of emotions I couldn't name. Desire, guilt, exhilaration, fear. And Mason was the lifeline I couldn't let go of, even if it meant being pulled under. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental, like crossing a bridge that would burn behind us the moment we stepped off. I turned to face him, my breath catching as his eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine with a softness that made my chest ache. The kiss deepened, and before I knew it, I was lying back on the couch, his body pressing against mine. His hand slid under my shirt, exploring, discovering, igniting something in me that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't think about Greg. I didn't think about the consequences or the inevitable fallout. All I could think about was Mason, the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. Afterward, as we lay tangled together on the couch, the weight of what we'd done began to sink in. Mason's hand traced lazy patterns on my arm, his breath warm against my neck. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice quieter this time. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how to put into words the whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. "I don't know," I admitted finally. He shifted so he could look at me, his expression soft but serious. "I don't regret it," he said. "Not for a second." His words sent a thrill through me, but they also scared me. Because as much as I didn't want to admit it, I didn't regret it either. But I knew this was only the beginning. We'd crossed a line, and there was no going back now. If the first kiss was crossing the line, then everything that came after was tearing it to shreds. Mason and I couldn't stop. What started in the attic, then spilled over to the couch, didn't end there. It became a routine, stolen moments, hushed whispers, and glances that lingered just a little too long. There was no going back, and honestly, neither of us wanted to. The guilt should have been unbearable. But every time I felt its claws digging in, Mason's touch would erase it. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. A week after that first night, Greg was out late again, some union meeting that would drag on until well past midnight. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Mason walked in, his hair damp from a shower, wearing a plain white t-shirt and sweatpants. The simplicity of his appearance caught me off guard. There was nothing particularly suggestive about it, yet my heart raced at the sight of him. "You're cooking again?" he asked. leaning against the counter with a smile that was entirely too charming. "Greg expects dinner on the table whether he's here or not," I said with a shrug, stirring the pot on the stove. Mason moved closer, his hand brushing mine as he reached for a glass of water. The small, intentional touch sent a jolt through me. "Let me help," he said, standing so close behind me that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "It's just spaghetti," I said, my voice a little too breathy. "I know," he murmured, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear. I turned, my resolve already crumbling, and found myself face to face with him. His eyes were dark, filled with something that made my knees weak. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, even as I leaned into him. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice low and confident. He was right. I didn't. From that night on, our affair escalated. We became bolder, less careful. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniably intense. It was the way he made me feel wanted, seen. Every time we touched, every time he kissed me, it was like a spark reigniting something in me I thought had burned out long ago. Mason and I found ways to be alone, even in the most mundane moments. He'd brush past me in the hallway, his fingers grazing mine. We'd exchange knowing looks across the dinner table when Greg was home, our secret hanging in the air between us like a taut string. The risk made it all the more thrilling. One particularly warm evening, Greg had gone to bed early after complaining about a headache. Mason and I were sitting by the backyard pool, the faint glow of the underwater lights casting ripples of light across his face. "You know he'll find out eventually," I said, swirling my wine in the glass. Mason leaned back in the lounge chair beside me, his gaze fixed on the water. "Then we'll deal with it," he said simply, as if it were that easy. "It's not that simple," I said, shaking my head. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you want to stop?" "No," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he stood, holding out his hand to me. "Come here," he said. I hesitated, glancing toward the house to make sure all the lights were off. Then I slipped my hand into his, letting him pull me to my feet. He led me to the edge of the pool, the cool tile rough under my bare feet. Before I could say anything, he pulled me close, his hands settling on my waist. His lips found mine, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. As the weeks passed, our secret world grew more elaborate. We found ways to steal time together whenever we could. The art studio above the garage became one of our favorite hideouts. It was a space I rarely used anymore, filled with half-finished canvases and forgotten brushes. Mason would follow me up there, under the pretense of helping me organize. But the second the door closed, all pretense would vanish. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the dusty windows, he pushed me against a table, his lips trailing down my neck. The risk of being caught was always there, but it only made the moments more intoxicating. Of course, the more reckless we became, the closer we came to being discovered. One morning, Greg left for work earlier than usual, leaving Mason and me alone in the kitchen. He was standing behind me, his hands on my waist, when the sound of the front door opening froze us both in place. "Hello?" called Natalie, my best friend, who had a habit of dropping by unannounced. I shoved Mason away, smoothing my hair and trying to steady my breathing. He quickly retreated to his room as Natalie stepped into the kitchen, her sharp eyes scanning the space. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone light but probing. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "I didn't hear you come in." She didn't say anything, but the way she looked at me made my stomach twist. Then there was Adam, Mason's college friend. He showed up one evening while Greg was out, claiming he wanted to catch up. Mason and I were in the living room when Adam arrived, and I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes as he looked at us. "You two seem close," he said casually, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Just keeping him out of trouble," I replied, my smile tight. Adam didn't stay long, but his presence lingered like a shadow. Later, when Mason and I were alone, I asked him if Adam suspected anything. "He doesn't know," Mason said, but the tension in his voice told me otherwise. The final straw came one night when Greg came home earlier than expected. Mason and I were in the art studio, the door locked but the soundproofing non-existent. "Vivienne?" Greg's voice echoed from downstairs, followed by the creak of the stairs. My heart leapt into my throat. Mason and I scrambled apart, frantically straightening our clothes as the sound of Greg's footsteps grew louder. He stopped outside the door, his shadow visible through the crack beneath it. "What are you doing up there?" he called. "Just organizing some old paintings," I said, my voice trembling. There was a long pause before he finally retreated downstairs. Mason looked at me, his face pale. "We're running out of time," he said quietly. I nodded, my stomach churning. The walls were closing in, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I should have known our luck wouldn't last. Secrets like ours never stay buried, and it only takes one crack for the entire facade to crumble. It started with Natalie. She showed up at the house one afternoon while Greg was at work and Mason was out running errands. I let her in, offering her coffee like nothing was wrong, but I could tell something was off. "Lorraine," she said as she sat at the kitchen table, her eyes sharper than usual. "We need to talk." I felt my chest tighten. "About what?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "About Mason." The air in the room shifted, heavy with implication. I tried to play dumb, laughing nervously as I poured the coffee. "What about Mason?" "Don't insult me," she snapped, her voice low but firm. "I saw the way he looks at you, and I saw the way you look at him. Don't tell me I'm imagining it." My hands trembled as I set the coffee pot down. "Natalie, it's not what you think." "Stop," she said, cutting me off. "I don't want to know the details, but I'm telling you right now, if Greg finds out." She let the sentence hang in the air, her meaning clear. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She didn't need to threaten me outright. Her silence was a conditional gift, one that could be revoked at any moment. "You have to end it," she said, her tone softening. "Whatever's going on, it's going to destroy you." As if Natalie's warning wasn't enough, Adam made things worse. A few days later, I overheard Mason arguing with someone on the phone in the backyard. His voice was sharp, agitated, and although I couldn't make out every word, one name stood out: mine. Later that night, as we lay together in my bed, I asked him about it. "It's Adam," he admitted reluctantly. "He suspects something." "What does he know?" I whispered, my pulse quickening. "Not much," Mason said, but his face told a different story. "He saw us texting. He's asking questions." I sat up, panic bubbling in my chest. "Mason, this is getting out of control. If Adam says something to Greg—" "He won't," Mason interrupted, his tone firm. "I'll handle it." But his words did little to ease my fears. The tipping point came in the form of an unmarked envelope left in our mailbox. Greg brought it in with the rest of the mail, tossing it onto the kitchen counter without a second thought. I only noticed it later, when I was sorting through the pile. The envelope felt heavier than the others, its contents rigid and ominous. I opened it in the privacy of my bedroom, my hands trembling. Inside were a series of photographs, grainy but unmistakable. Me and Mason. One was from the attic window, another from the backyard pool, and the last, by far the worst, was from the art studio. My heart sank as I stared at the images, my mind racing. There was no note, no explanation, just the damning evidence. But the message was clear. Someone knew. That evening, Greg came home earlier than usual, his face tight with suspicion. "Who the hell is Adam?" he asked, slamming his phone down on the kitchen counter. I froze. "What?" "Adam. He called me," Greg growled. "He said there's something going on in this house, something I need to know about." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Greg's eyes narrowed. "What aren't you telling me, Lorraine?" Before I could answer, Mason walked into the room, his expression shifting the second he saw Greg's face. "Perfect timing," Greg snapped, turning to Mason. "Maybe you can explain why your friend is calling me, saying my wife's acting suspicious." Mason's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "Adam doesn't know what he's talking about." "Doesn't he?" Greg shot back, his voice rising. "Greg, calm down," I said, trying to step between them. "No," Greg barked, his eyes blazing with fury. "I'm not calming down, not until someone tells me what the hell is going on." And then Mason said it. "It's me." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. Greg stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "What the fuck are you talking about?" Mason's gaze flicked to me, then back to Greg. "It's me. Lorraine and I." "Stop," I pleaded, but it was too late. Greg's face contorted with rage as the pieces clicked into place. "You've got to be kidding me," he snarled, his voice shaking. The next few seconds were a blur. Greg lunged at Mason, his fist connecting with his jaw. Mason stumbled back, but he didn't stay down. He retaliated, shoving Greg hard enough to send him crashing into the counter. "Stop it!" I screamed, but neither of them listened. The fight escalated, fists flying, furniture toppling. And then it happened. Mason shoved Greg again, harder this time. Greg's foot caught on the edge of the rug, and he fell backward, his head striking the corner of the kitchen island with a sickening thud. Everything went still. "Dad?" Mason's voice broke the silence, trembling with panic. I rushed to Greg's side, my hands shaking as I pressed them against the wound on his head. He was breathing, but barely. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the pristine tile floor. "Call 911, I said, my voice cracking. Mason fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed. The paramedics arrived minutes later, though it felt like hours. They loaded Greg onto a stretcher, their faces grim as they wheeled him out of the house. Mason and I stood in the kitchen, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a suffocating fog. "This is my fault," Mason said, his voice hollow. "No," I said, though the words felt meaningless. We didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. The ambulance lights faded down the street, leaving me and Mason standing in the eerie silence of the kitchen. The blood on the floor had started to dry, darkening to a shade that made my stomach churn. I wanted to clean it, to make it disappear, but my legs wouldn't move. Mason sat at the table, his head in his hands, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. Greg was alive, but the paramedics hadn't been reassuring. They said words like severe head trauma and possible brain swelling, and each one felt like a knife to my chest. But the worst part wasn't what might happen to Greg, it was what would happen to us. The phone call came hours later. Greg had survived the surgery, but the damage was significant. He'd need weeks, maybe months, of rehabilitation. When I hung up, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Relief, guilt, and dread all tangled together in my chest. The next morning, I went to the hospital. Mason wanted to come, but I told him to stay home. I wasn't sure how Greg would react to seeing him, or me, for that matter. When I walked into the hospital room, I found Clara sitting by his bedside. Yes, that Clara. Her hand rested on Greg's, and her face lit up with relief when she saw me. "He's awake," she said, as though I should be happy. Greg turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing when they landed on me. His voice was weak but laced with venom. "You've got some nerve showing up here." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sting of his words. "Greg, I'm sorry for everything." He let out a bitter laugh, wincing as it jostled his injuries. "Save it, Lorraine. I know exactly what you've been doing. Elaine told me everything." My heart sank. Of course, Elaine couldn't resist twisting the knife. Greg's gaze flicked to Clara, then back to me. "You don't need to worry about coming back. Clara's been more of a wife to me than you ever were." The words should have hurt more than they did, but all I felt was exhaustion. I nodded, unable to summon the energy to argue. "I'll pack my things?" I said quietly. "Good," he muttered, closing his eyes. Clara didn't look at me as I left the room. That night, I packed my bags. Mason watched from the doorway, his face pale, his shoulders tense. "You're really leaving?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have a choice," I said, zipping the last suitcase. "Then I'm coming with you." "No, Mason." I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "You can't." "Why not?" he demanded, stepping closer. "I don't care about Greg, or what anyone else thinks. I want to be with you." His words made my heart ache, but I shook my head. "You've already given up so much for me. I can't let you throw away your future." "I don't care about my future if you're not in it," he said, his voice breaking. I reached out, cupping his face in my hands. "You'll care someday, and when that day comes, you'll realize this was the right thing to do." He didn't say anything else, but the pain in his eyes was enough to shatter what little resolve I had left. I moved into a small apartment 2 towns over, the kind of place you rent when you're trying to disappear. The furniture was secondhand, the walls thin, but it was quiet. I started freelancing more, taking on projects that paid the bills but didn't require much thought. For weeks, I didn't hear from Mason. I told myself it was for the best, that he was moving on, but the silence was unbearable. Then, one afternoon, a postcard arrived in the mail. It was from Seattle, the city Mason had always talked about wanting to visit. There was no return address, just a short message written in his familiar scrawl. "I'm okay. I hope you are too. If you ever want to see me, you know where to find me." I sat on the edge of my bed, the card trembling in my hands. I wanted to call him, to write back, to pack my bags and go to him. But I didn't. Not yet. Now I sit by the window every evening watching the sun dip below the horizon. Sometimes I think about Mason, his smile, his touch, the way he made me feel like I mattered. And sometimes I think about the life I left behind, the mistakes I made, the people I hurt. But mostly, I think about the future. Maybe one day I'll pick up the phone. Maybe one day I'll reply to that postcard. But for now, I let the memories live in the quiet spaces of my life, a reminder of the fire we burned too brightly to sustain. And for now, that's enough. I never thought I'd find myself staring at an empty dining room, paint rollers in hand, wondering if a fresh coat of color could change the way this house made me feel. The once vibrant space, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses during family dinners, now sat hollow. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a presence, heavy and unrelenting. The idea to repaint had come to me on a whim, part of my attempt to reclaim the house from the memories that seemed to cling to every corner. Paul, my late husband, had loved this room. It was where we celebrated birthdays, toasted anniversaries, and gathered with family. Now, 5 years after his passing, it felt like a mausoleum, a shrine to a life I couldn't seem to move past. That's when Ethan stepped in, as he often did. "Repainting the dining room?" he'd asked a week ago, his smile teasing but kind. "You planning to tackle that alone?" Ethan had a way of making me feel seen, even when I didn't want to be. At 28, he carried himself with a confidence that was equal parts natural and practiced. He was Paul's son from his first marriage, but over the years, he had become a steady presence in my life. After Paul's death, Ethan had been my rock, helping with house repairs, checking in with phone calls, making sure I wasn't drowning in my own solitude. "I can handle it," I'd replied, though the truth was, I wasn't sure I could. He'd raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "I'll come by Saturday," he said, as though the matter was settled. Saturday arrived with the promise of clear skies and warm sunlight. Ethan showed up just as I was dragging the paint cans into the dining room, his casual confidence already filling the house. "Didn't I tell you to wait for me?" he teased, leaning against the doorway. I glanced up, my heart giving a strange little flutter at the sight of him. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his jeans faded, but there was something about the way he carried himself that always caught me off guard. "I thought I'd get a head start," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Uh-huh," he replied, stepping into the room and grabbing one of the paint cans. "You'd have spilled this all over the floor by now." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the smile tugging at my lips. "You're insufferable, you know that?" "So I've been told," he said with a grin, setting the can down and grabbing a roller. We worked in companionable silence for the first hour, the rhythm of the paint rollers filling the room. I focused on the task at hand, determined to ignore the way Ethan's presence seemed to shift the air around me. But it was impossible not to notice him. The way his shirt clung to his back as he stretched to reach the higher corners of the wall. The way his laughter filled the space when he caught me struggling to open a stubborn can of paint. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said, gently taking the can from my hands. "I'm not that helpless," I replied, though my breath hitched slightly when his fingers brushed mine. "I never said you were," he said, his voice softer now. It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone else, but it lingered. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me, a warmth, a pull, something I couldn't quite name. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation flowed more easily. We joked about my questionable choice of paint color. "Sunflower yellow? Really?" he'd said, laughing, and shared memories of Paul. Ethan told me stories I hadn't heard before, moments from his childhood that painted a fuller picture of the man I'd loved. "Dad used to bring me in here after school," Ethan said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "He'd make me sit at that table and do my homework while he cooked dinner. He always said this room was the heart of the house." I nodded, my throat tightening. "He loved this place," I said softly. "And so do you," Ethan replied, his eyes meeting mine. There was something in the way he looked at me then, steady, unflinching, as though he was seeing not just the woman I was now, but the one I'd been before life had worn me down. The moment passed quickly, but it left a mark. By the time we finished for the day, the room was half painted, the sunlight casting golden streaks across the floor. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, surveying our work with a satisfied smile. "Not bad for a day's work," he said, turning to me. "Not bad at all," I agreed, though my focus wasn't on the walls. As he packed up the paint supplies, I caught myself watching him, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to name. For years, this house had felt like a tomb, a place filled with memories but devoid of life. But now, with Ethan here, it felt different. Warmer, lighter. And as I stood in the doorway, the faint scent of paint in the air, I couldn't help but wonder if this project wasn't just about the dining room. Maybe it was about me, too. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my mind already on the task at hand. The half-painted dining room waited, the scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air. It had been years since I'd thrown myself into something like this, and a part of me relished the distraction. Ethan arrived not long after breakfast, a tray of coffees in hand, and a grin that was just a little too smug. "Figured you might need some fuel," he said, setting the cups on the counter. "I could have managed," I replied, though the sight of him leaning casually against the kitchen island made my pulse quicken in a way I didn't want to admit. "You're welcome," he teased, grabbing one of the cups and handing it to me. "Thanks," I muttered, taking a sip to avoid looking at him directly. Back in the dining room, we fell into an easy rhythm. The sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the space as we worked side by side. Ethan tackled the higher sections of the wall, standing confidently on the ladder, while I focused on the trim near the floor. "Careful down there," he said with a chuckle when I bumped into the bucket of paint with my knee. "Careful up there," I shot back, glancing up just as he stretched to reach a corner. The ladder wobbled slightly, and my heart lurched. "Ethan," I said, dropping my brush as I rushed toward him. "I'm fine," he assured me, stepping down with a grin. "You worry too much." "Someone has to," I muttered, picking up my brush again. But as the day wore on, I couldn't deny the way my focus kept drifting to him. The way his shirt clung to his back as he worked, the way his laughter seemed to fill the room, making it feel alive again. At one point, he turned suddenly, catching me mid-glance. "What?" he asked, his brow quirking in amusement. "Nothing," I said quickly, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. He didn't press, but the knowing smile he gave me lingered, making it harder to concentrate. We broke for lunch, sitting on the floor with sandwiches and cold drinks. The conversation turned light and easy, a welcome reprieve from the unspoken tension that seemed to build every time we were too close. "So," he said, gesturing to the walls around us, "why sunflower yellow?" I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't know. It felt cheerful, I guess." He smiled, his expression softening. "It suits you," he said. The comment caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I'm not sure anyone's ever called me cheerful," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "They should," he replied, his gaze steady. After lunch, we returned to the task at hand. The hours seemed to slip by as the room slowly transformed, the dull, faded walls replaced by vibrant color. At one point, as I crouched to reach a tricky corner, I felt him behind me, his presence warm and solid. "Here," he said, reaching down to steady the trim as I painted. His hand brushed against mine briefly, and the contact sent a jolt through me. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice unsteady. "Anytime," he said, his tone lighter, but I caught the flicker of something deeper in his eyes. By late afternoon, we'd nearly finished, the room glowing with new life. Ethan leaned against the ladder, surveying our work with a satisfied grin. "Not bad," he said, turning to me. "You might actually have a knack for this." "Don't push it," I said, though I couldn't help but smile. As he stepped down, he stumbled slightly, his foot catching on the last rung. Instinctively, I reached out, my hands finding his arm to steady him. "You okay?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. We were close, too close. I could feel the warmth of his skin through his shirt, the steady rhythm of his breathing. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I pulled back quickly, my hands falling to my sides as I stepped away. Careful, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Always, he replied, though his tone was laced with something I couldn't quite place. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, the weight of that moment lingering between us. Every glance, every accidental touch felt amplified, leaving me more unsettled than I cared to admit. That evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, I replayed the day in my mind. Ethan's laughter, the way his eyes lingered on mine, the warmth of his hand brushing against mine. It all felt too much, too soon. But as the stars began to appear in the sky, I couldn't deny the way he made me feel. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. And for the first time in years, neither did I. The next morning, the dining room was awash in sunlight, the newly painted yellow walls glowing warmly. I lingered by the doorway, coffee mug in hand, admiring the work Ethan and I had done. The space looked brighter, almost like it belonged to a different house, a different version of me. Not bad, Ethan said, startling me as he walked in with his usual easy confidence. He was holding a small tray of bagels and fruit, a gesture that felt too thoughtful and yet so typical of him. You keep bringing food over, I'm going to start expecting it, I teased, trying to keep my tone light. Well, can't have you passing out mid-project, he replied, setting the tray down on the dining room table. There was a lightness to our exchange, but beneath it, something else simmered, a quiet awareness of how close we'd come the day before. As we ate breakfast, the conversation turned to the list of remaining house projects. The casual topic was a welcome distraction, though every now and then our eyes would meet, and I'd feel that familiar flutter in my chest. Afterward, Ethan suggested tackling the bookshelf in the study, which had been leaning precariously to one side for months. Don't you think we should take a break? I asked, half joking. Fixing this house is my break, he said with a grin. Come on, you'll thank me when it doesn't collapse under the weight of all those books. In the study, we worked in tandem, the silence between us comfortable but filled with an undercurrent of tension. I handed him tools as he adjusted the shelves, watching as he worked with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. Dad used to hate this room, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, surprised. Really? Why? He shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. He always said it was too cluttered, but I think he just didn't like sitting still long enough to read. I laughed softly, the sound easing the weight in my chest. That sounds like him. Ethan glanced at me then, his expression softening. You miss him a lot, don't you? The question was simple, but it struck a chord. I nodded, my throat tightening. Every day, I admitted. We fell silent for a moment, the air between us heavy with shared grief. Then Ethan set down the screwdriver and turned to face me fully. You know, he used to talk about you all the time, he said. How much he admired you, how lucky he felt to have you. I blinked, caught off guard by the emotion in his voice. He did? Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. He loved you, Meredith, more than anything. The sincerity in his words brought tears to my eyes, and I looked away, my hands trembling slightly. Thank you for telling me that, I whispered. You deserve to hear it, he said softly. We worked in relative silence after that, but the moment lingered, a quiet connection forming in the shared vulnerability. When we finally finished, Ethan stood back, surveying the now sturdy bookshelf with a satisfied smile. Perfect, he said, brushing his hands on his jeans. Thanks for the help, I said, though my voice carried more weight than I intended. Always, he replied, his eyes lingering on mine for just a second too long. That evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, we decided to sit on the back porch with glasses of wine. The air was cool, the sound of crickets filling the silence between us. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You ever think about what comes next? He asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? For you, he said, turning to look at me. What's next for you? I hesitated, the weight of the question settling over me. I don't know, I admitted. For a long time, it felt like there wasn't a next, like everything ended when Paul. I trailed off, the words catching in my throat. But now, he pressed gently. I took a deep breath, my gaze drifting to the glass in my hand. Now, I'm starting to think maybe there is, I said quietly. The honesty of the moment made my chest ache, and I could feel Ethan's eyes on me, his presence steady and grounding. You deserve to be happy, Meredith, he said, his voice low but firm. I looked at him then, the sincerity in his expression nearly undoing me. It's been so long since I've even thought about what that means, I admitted. Then maybe it's time to start, he said simply. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction behind them, sent a shiver through me. As the night wore on, the conversation grew lighter, but the weight of what we'd shared lingered. At one point, Ethan reached for the bottle of wine to pour us another glass, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt my breath hitch. I glanced at him, my heart racing as I caught the way his gaze softened, his focus entirely on me. "Meredith," he said softly, my name hanging in the air between us. I didn't know what to say, so I looked away, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan leaned back, breaking the tension with a quiet laugh. "Sorry," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to make things weird." "You didn't," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed the conflict churning inside me. He gave me a small smile, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want to push you," he said, "but I need you to know, I care about you. A lot." His confession left me breathless, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words. "Ethan, He shook his head, his smile softening. "It's okay, you don't have to say anything, I just needed you to know." The weight of his words settled over me, and as the night wore on, I found myself replaying them in my mind. When I finally went to bed, the house felt different, warmer, fuller, as though something had shifted. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about what might come next. The following day felt different, though I couldn't quite explain why. The house was quiet as usual, but there was a strange energy in the air, like something had shifted during the night. I found myself glancing at the clock more often than necessary, waiting for Ethan to arrive, though I told myself it was only because we still had projects to finish. When his car pulled into the driveway, I felt a flutter of something between anticipation and nervousness. "Morning," he said as he stepped inside, his usual easy grin in place. He carried a small box of tools and a bag of pastries, setting them down on the kitchen counter. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Ready to tackle the living room today?" he asked, pulling a croissant from the bag and offering it to me. "Sure," I said, though the thought of spending another day in such close proximity to him made my pulse quicken. We started with the shelves in the living room, reorganizing and reinforcing them where necessary. It was a slow, methodical task, but the quiet moments between us only seemed to amplify the tension that had been building. At one point, as I handed him a stack of books, his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, my breath catching in my throat. "Thanks," he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine for just a moment too long. I quickly turned away, pretending to busy myself with another pile of books, but the heat in my cheeks was impossible to ignore. As the morning wore on, the tension between us became harder to dismiss. Every glance, every accidental touch felt magnified, like we were both acutely aware of the space, or lack thereof, between us. While dusting one of the higher shelves, I stretched to reach the top, balancing precariously on my tiptoes. "Careful," Ethan said, stepping closer. "I've got it," I replied, though the wobble in my stance said otherwise. Before I could steady myself, he reached out, his hands gently gripping my waist to keep me balanced. "There," he said, his voice low. The warmth of his hands, the steadiness of his touch, it was too much. I stepped down quickly, putting distance between us, though my heart was racing. "Thanks," I murmured, not meeting his eyes. "Anytime," he replied, his tone light, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. By midday, the living room shelves were complete, and Ethan suggested taking a break. "Let's step outside," he said. "It's too nice a day to stay cooped up in here." We walked out to the back patio, the sun warm against my skin. Ethan leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Just tired," I said quickly, though the truth was far more complicated. He nodded, but the look he gave me told me he didn't quite believe it. As the afternoon wore on, the unspoken tension between us grew harder to ignore. Every glance felt loaded, every brush of his hand against mine, intentional. When we moved back inside to tackle the final section of the living room, The silence was almost deafening. "Meredith?" Ethan said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Yes?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder at him. He hesitated, his gaze steady but uncertain. "Have I done something to make you uncomfortable?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "No," I said finally, though my voice wavered. "Because if I have—" "You haven't," I interrupted, turning to face him fully. The air between us felt charged, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "Then what is it?" he asked, stepping closer. I shook my head, my chest tightening. "Ethan, I don't know how to explain it." "Try," he said softly. I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the table for support. "It's just, everything feels different with you," I admitted, my voice trembling. He stepped closer still, his presence grounding and overwhelming all at once. "Different how?" "Like I can't stop thinking about you," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "And it scares me." Ethan's expression softened, and he reached for my hand, his touch gentle. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this." The confession hung between us, raw and unfiltered. I could feel the warmth of his hand against mine, the quiet certainty in his gaze. "Ethan, I trailed off, my throat tight with emotion. "It's okay," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against my fingers. "You don't have to say anything right now." The tenderness in his voice broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into him, my forehead resting against his chest. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. When I finally pulled back, Ethan cupped my face gently, his eyes searching mine. "Meredith, I care about you," he said, his voice firm but soft. "More than I probably should." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath catch as he leaned in slightly. I didn't stop him. When his lips met mine, it was like the air was pulled from the room. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, the weight of all our unspoken feelings pouring into that single moment. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice shaky. "Maybe it does," he replied, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." I nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "Together," he promised. The days following that kiss felt like a blur. Every interaction with Ethan was tinged with a new intensity, a quiet understanding that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The house felt fuller when he was in it, every corner brimming with the weight of what we'd shared. Yet, neither of us brought it up. Until that Saturday evening. The sun was setting as we stood in the dining room, now completely painted and furnished. The sunflower yellow walls glowed warmly in the fading light, a reflection of the quiet transformation happening within me. "It looks good," Ethan said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "It does," I agreed, though my focus wasn't on the room. He turned to me then, his gaze steady. "You're different," he said softly. I blinked, startled by the comment. "Different how?" "Lighter," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Happier." The sincerity in his words sent a wave of emotion through me, and I looked away, my chest tightening. As the evening wore on, we drifted to the porch, a bottle of wine between us. The breeze carried the faint scent of salt water, and the sound of the waves was a soothing backdrop to the tension crackling between us. "Meredith?" Ethan said suddenly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "Yes?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "We can't keep pretending nothing's changed." My breath hitched, and I set my glass down, my fingers trembling. "I know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then why do you keep pulling away?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. I swallowed hard, the question cutting through my defenses. "Because I'm scared," I said honestly. Whatever this is, it's not supposed to happen." "Who says?" he countered, leaning forward. I opened my mouth to reply, but found myself at a loss. "I don't care what anyone thinks," he continued, his voice steady. "What I feel for you, it's real, Meredith, and I think you feel it too." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "I do," I said, my voice trembling, "but it doesn't make it any less complicated." "Life is complicated," he said softly, reaching for my hand, "but that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for what makes us happy." I stared at him, my heart racing. For so long, I'd let fear dictate my choices, let grief keep me trapped in the past. But Ethan's words, his presence, made me feel like maybe I could have something more. Without thinking, I leaned toward him, my lips finding his in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release, a quiet surrender to everything we'd been holding back. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt the world around us fade away. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. "This feels right," he said softly. "It does," I admitted, my voice trembling. The moment deepened as he led me inside, the unspoken tension between us giving way to something raw and undeniable. The living room, with its warm light and familiar furniture, felt like the right place for what came next. Ethan's touch was tentative at first, his hands brushing against mine as he guided me to the couch. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and filled with concern. "Yes," I said, the single word carrying more certainty than I'd felt in years. What followed wasn't hurried or careless. It was slow, deliberate, every movement filled with emotion. His hands traced the lines of my face, his touch reverent, as though he were memorizing every detail. When his lips met mine again, it was with a passion that left me breathless. The barriers between us dissolved, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The moment was more than physical. It was emotional, a connection that ran deeper than I'd thought possible. Afterward, we sat together in the quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the ocean outside. Ethan's arm was wrapped around me, his touch grounding and comforting. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his gaze filled with concern. "I am," I said, resting my head against his chest. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." His hand brushed against my hair, and I felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my cheek. The night felt like a turning point, a moment when everything shifted. But with that shift came a quiet fear, a realization that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. Ethan was quiet for a moment before replying. "We take it one day at a time," he said. "We figure it out together." I nodded, his words bringing a small measure of comfort. As the hours passed, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. The house that had once felt so empty now felt full of possibility. And Ethan, with his quiet strength and unwavering presence, had become the light in a darkness I hadn't even realized I was living in. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, I felt a quiet sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, I could embrace this new chapter of my life. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. I woke up on the couch, Ethan's arms still draped around me, his breathing steady and peaceful. For a moment, I simply watched him, letting the quiet calm of the morning settle over me. I hadn't felt this at ease in years. The ache of loneliness that had defined my days since Paul's passing now seemed like a distant echo, replaced by something I never thought I'd feel again. Hope. As Ethan stirred, his eyes slowly opened, and a soft smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm. "Morning," I replied, my own smile tugging at the corners of my lips. We stayed like that for a while, neither of us rushing to move or speak. It was as if we both knew that this moment was fragile, that stepping out of it would mean facing the reality of what lay ahead. Eventually, Ethan broke the silence. "How are you feeling?" I took a deep breath, considering his question. "Scared," I admitted softly. "But also hopeful." He nodded, his thumb brushing gently against my arm. "Me too," he said. It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of everything we were navigating. Later, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, we made our way to the kitchen. Ethan started the coffee, and I pulled out bread and eggs, our movements easy and familiar. It felt natural, like we'd done this 100 times before. But as we sat down to eat, the weight of what we needed to discuss hung between us. "What happens next?" I asked, breaking the silence. Ethan set his coffee mug down, his gaze steady. "I want this," he said simply. "I want us. But I know it's not going to be easy." I nodded, my chest tightening. "There's a lot to think about," I said. "There is," he agreed. "But I'm willing to take it one step at a time, if you are." His words were like a lifeline, grounding me in the uncertainty of it all. The days that followed were a strange mix of joy and hesitation. Ethan stayed for the rest of the weekend, helping me with small projects around the house and filling the space with his laughter and easy presence. But as Sunday evening approached, reality began to creep in. Ethan had to leave for work the next morning, and the house would once again feel too quiet, too empty. "I'll come back next weekend," he said as we stood by the door, his bag slung over his shoulder. "You don't have to," I said, though part of me desperately wanted him to. "I want to," he replied firmly. "And I'll call every night if that's okay." "It's more than okay," I said, my voice trembling. As he leaned in to kiss me goodbye, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me. It wasn't just a goodbye, it was a promise, a quiet commitment to whatever this was between us. When his car pulled out of the driveway, the house felt empty again, but this time it didn't feel so permanent. Ethan kept his promise. He called every night, his voice a steady presence in the quiet evenings. We talked about everything: work, memories of Paul, even mundane things like what we'd had for dinner. Over the next few weeks, he visited every chance he got, and each visit brought us closer. We worked on the house together, filling it with laughter and warmth, and I began to see it as more than just a relic of the past. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of what we were doing felt too heavy. But every time, Ethan was there, steady and unwavering. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to him, my heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," I said softly. "For what?" he asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "For reminding me that life doesn't end with loss," I said, my voice trembling. "For making me feel alive again." He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. "You've done the same for me," he said simply. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship deepened, and I found myself letting go of the guilt and fear that had once held me back. The house, once a place of sorrow, had become a place of renewal, a space where I could imagine a future instead of clinging to the past. One evening, as we finished another project, Ethan turned to me, his expression serious. "This house feels different now," he said. "It does," I agreed, looking around the room we'd just finished painting. "That's because of you," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You've brought it back to life." Tears filled my eyes and I smiled, my chest tight with emotion. "We did that together," I said. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. Our journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because with Ethan by my side, I knew we could face anything. Together.